Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Ahnaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We're very pleased today to be joined by Jonathan Spire, who is the Director of Research here at the Middle East Forum, and he is joining us today to discuss the current events that are unfolding in Syria with the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime by the rebel Islamist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Now, Mr. Spire will be speaking for 15 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Jonathan Spire.
Thank you very much, Ahnaf, and hello to everybody. So since we are limited in time, what I won't do is kind of re-rehearse the events, the very dramatic and indeed historic, I would say, events of recent days, because I think everybody's now familiar with the process whereby Hayat Tahrir al-Sham launched its offensive into Aleppo city, maybe even unexpected to itself, took Aleppo, then down to Hama, Homs, and then, of course, the dramatic entry into Damascus just on Saturday, and the abrupt fall of the Assad regime. Let's assume that we all basically have that picture already in our heads, and I'd like to use the time available to talk about what appears to be happening now in real time on a number of different related axes with regard to developments since those dramatic events and the entry of the Sunni Islamist insurgents into Damascus and the departure, of course, of President Bashar al-Assad. The first area that I want to consider is that of what is HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, doing on the political level since its entry into Damascus. Are there indications yet of the kind of governance that we can expect to emerge in Syria in the period now opening up? And in that regard, let me say a couple of things. Firstly, talking to people that I know in Damascus over the last 48 hours or so, it is apparent that the HTS control over the city is holding. There is a curfew in Damascus right now, which begins at 4 every afternoon and goes on till 5 in the morning. The streets are empty. The rebel forces are in control. There is very little unrest. The rebels are not going on the rampage. There appears to be a certain degree of discipline among the forces. This thus far with regard to the physical look of things in the vitally important capital. Now, politically, things are also developing very rapidly as well. And they're developing in a fairly familiar pattern, I would say. Today, it was announced that Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, the leader of HTS, has chosen a man called Muhammad al-Bashir to be the prime minister of the interim government that HTS is creating. He will replace a man called Muhammad al-Jalili, who was Bashar Assad's prime minister, the prime minister of the outgoing, so to speak, government. Now, when I say that's familiar, what do I mean by that? It's not been sufficiently, I think, examined in media yet, the fact that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is not entirely a stranger to governance. Rather, they have, over the last half decade now, been running their own small government in Idlib province, the province, of course, of northwest Syria, which they controlled under the tutelage or patronage of the Turkish armed forces over the last half decade. In Idlib province, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham ran a thing which they called the Syrian Salvation Government. The prime minister of that government was none other than a man called Muhammad al-Bashir. That is to say, the man who has just now been appointed by Abu Muhammad al-Jolani as the interim prime minister of Syria. The governance in Idlib province under Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was tight, was well organized, was authoritarian in character. There was a Shura council, which was the ostensible governing body. Behind all this, there was HTS itself as the armed organization, which while its members did not possess ministerial or governmental positions, was the real authority. And behind HTS was the authoritarian leader of HTS, namely Ahmed Shara'a Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. So what appears to be currently in the process of being created in Syria is the governance of the Syrian Salvation Government of Idlib writ large. That is to say, an Islamic, Sunni Islamic, Islamist, authoritarian mode of governance in which elected bodies exist and have their elected leaders carrying out administrative tasks, and in which the real authority, real power behind those bodies is the armed group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, led by the authoritarian leader Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani. That is to say, it would be my estimation that what we are witnessing are the opening moves of an attempt to create an authoritarian Sunni Islamic mode of government in Syria, in which Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani emerges as the new authoritarian leader. That at least is what this looks like to me. And we're going to find out, of course, in the weeks and months ahead, if that assessment is accurate. This is the first axis which I wanted to mention, the emergent political axis. It is important to remember that while the Assad regime may have quickly collapsed, that does not mean that all fighting has ended in Syria. And there are two processes of conflict currently going on. And what I'd like to now quickly do is to cover or take a look at those. One of them is the assault by a different Turkish-supported rebel alliance to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham against the Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces. Inside the area of control that the Turks established in northwest Syria were two de facto governances or governments. One was the Syrian Salvation Government that we've just discussed. Another was a thing which called itself the Syrian Interim Government, and which had its own army called the Syrian National Army, or the Jaysh al-Watani al-Suri. This was an amalgamation by the Turks of a bunch of rebel militias from northern Syria. It's a much less unified, much less disciplined, I think probably quite a bit less effective military force than HTS is. The Turks are currently launching it, not southwards as HTS went, but eastwards against the Kurdish autonomy, mainly located east of the river Euphrates. They've taken a town called Tel Rifat in the first days following Assad's fall. They have taken now the important town of Manbij, although there are still disputed accounts going on social media. What I hear, at least from the people I trust, is that Manbij has fallen to the Syrian National Army, and they've taken a bunch of villages down in Deir ez-Zor province, but still west of the Euphrates, away from SDF. It means that the Kurds are falling back. As of now, this is not yet a catastrophe, because all of the towns and villages that the Kurds are losing are west of the Euphrates. Should the Syrian National Army cross the Euphrates into the heartland of the Kurdish autonomy in Syria, then from the point of view of the Kurds, they could well be facing disaster. And what would then transpire would then become clear that a key goal of Turkish President Erdogan is to rapidly try to destroy the Kurdish autonomy east of the Euphrates, which he considers to be a wing, of course, of the PKK organization, which is an insurgent organization engaged in insurgency against Turkey. It means that the Kurdish Authority is probably in a more beleaguered position now than at any time in the last 10 years. The last time when it was facing this kind of trouble was when ISIS was sweeping against it back in 2013, 2014. So this is a very important existing fighting front still in which combat's taking place in Syria, insufficiently recorded by media, which is mainly concerned, for understandable reasons, maybe with the story in Damascus right now. But this is very, very important too. The third axis of continued conflict that I want to touch on is that of Israel. Israel, of course, has currently pushed some kilometers into the buffer zone established by the disengagement of forces or separation of forces agreement of 1974 after the 1973 Yom Kippur or October war. Israel has not pushed past the Bravo line of that buffer zone, which would bring it into Syria proper, and it is probable that Israel will not do so. But Israel has captured significant high ground, the Syrian Mount Hermon, and also a number of villages and towns. clearly with the intention or clearly with the understanding that what's about to emerge in Syria may well not be friendly to Israel, and therefore there is a need for a buffer zone to keep whatever it's going to be a long way away from the Israeli Golan Heights. At the same time, Israel is carrying out a very wide-ranging a very wide-ranging air campaign right now against military targets across Syria, up to and including, we are now hearing, the entirety of Syria's relatively modest fleet of fighter aircraft of MiG-29s, all of which, according to the latest reports, have been destroyed by Israel over the last couple of days, but also including, we are told, ammunition dumps, also area storage locations for surface-to-air missiles, also facilities related to the regime's chemical weapons program. Clearly, what Israel is trying to do is in the kind of twilight zone between regimes in Syria, in which the old regime has gone, but a new regime has not yet quite emerged. Israel is trying to substantially weaken Syria's military capacity with the intention that whatever regime emerges, it'll take it a long time for it to get itself back to anywhere close to being able to constitute a threat to Israel. Israel hasn't been commenting openly, of course, on Abu Muhammad al-Jolani and HTS and the rest of it, and wishes to judiciously avoid commenting on internal Syrian matters, except, by the way, notably, in the case of a number of foreign officials, to express concern at the situation of minorities in Syria, specifically the Kurds and the Druze populations, but generally trying to avoid political judgment. But I think if you look at the actions of the Israeli armed forces over the last sort of 72 hours in Syria, you can kind of get a sense of what Israel's thinking about the emergent government, which may be about to emerge in Damascus, and it's not particularly encouraging thought. Lastly, then, just before this brief initial remarks, having looked at what I think are the three axes which we need to be concentrating on, let me just say a couple of words about the bigger picture of strategic implications of what has just taken place in Syria. Firstly, and most obviously, this is a massive historic blow to the Iran-led regional axis. The loss of Syria, potentially, and I think it will turn out this way also, cuts the territorial contiguity of the Iran-led regional alliance. Its greatest achievement strategically in many ways was to have reached the Mediterranean for Iran by effectively taking over three contiguous Arab countries, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, or at least maintaining freedom of action for Iranian forces in those areas. That situation has now ended because the middle link in that chain, namely Syria, has been cut off, has been lost to the Iranians. It means that Lebanese Hezbollah, isolated now on the Mediterranean from its land supply lines, is in a weaker position now, arguably, than at any time, arguably since its foundation, since the very first days of the movement. Cut off from Iran, very possibly facing an angry Sunni Islamic Syria bent on retribution. These, after all, are the same fighters in HTS who fought Lebanese Hezbollah during the Syrian civil war in some very, very fierce battles. So this is a very major blow coming in the wake of a whole series of earlier blows, the way of the beating administered by Israel to Hezbollah in recent months, the loss of Hamas as an effective fighting force, the inability, evidently, of Iran to defend itself against Israeli air attacks on its air defense systems, or the stripping of Iran of its air defense systems. So coming in the wake of those hits, and in many ways made possible because of those hits, specifically because of the inability, really, of Hezbollah to intervene to help Bashar Assad, Iran is now at its weakest, at its nadir in many ways, at a lower point in many ways than we can remember, at least over the last decade. That's kind of the good news. I guess I'll conclude with the bad news, which is the following. Yeah, Iran has been laid low, but what's come up what has returned in many ways now to prominence in the region are forces which in many ways, many observers thought had been kind of eclipsed over the last years, namely Sunni political Islam or Sunni Islamism. Sunni Islamism, of course, had its high moment in the region about a decade ago during the so-called Arab Spring, when Islamist governments emerged in Egypt and in Tunisia, and when a massive Sunni Islamist insurgency, calling itself Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, carved out a de facto Islamic State, which it declared to be the Caliphate in the summer of 2014. That episode proved brief. The Islamists left power in Tunisia and Egypt. The Islamic State was destroyed by a US-led coalition. And many observers thought, well, Sunni political Islam has now had its moment in the sun, and strategy in the Middle East will now be defined by the rising, advancing Iran-led regional alliance facing against Israel and other Western associated states. As it now turns out, the Iranian threat hasn't been removed, but has been significantly weakened. But so far, at least in the crucial space of Syria, what has rushed in to fill the gap is not forces aligned with the United States and the Abraham Accords and that end of regional politics, but rather movements associated with Sunni political Islam. By the way, in its more extreme, or it's one of its most extreme forms, aligned with and clearly allied with the Republic of Turkey and the Emirate of Qatar. So up until now, at least, from a strategic point of view, the events of recent days in Syria constitute the abrupt return of Sunni political Islam into the front and center of regional political and strategic considerations. And as of now, at least, it looks like there's going to be quite a lot more of that, at least in the Syrian context, because nothing right now from within the Syrian Arab context, at least, appears to be anywhere remotely close to the strength which HTS and its backers currently wield. So I'll stop on that cheerful note, and we have, I guess, 13, 14 minutes for discussion and questions. So I look forward to the questions.
All right, well, thank you, Jonathan. I will begin with a question here from Jay Lewis, who asks, this overthrow of the regime is seen as a victory of sorts for Turkey, who supported Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. How will this affect Turkey's relation with both the West in general and Israel in particular?
Regarding the West in general, I mean, obviously, President Donald Trump is about to return to the White House, and much will depend on how he chooses to see this. My sense, at least from the way that al-Jolani has been conducting himself ever since coming to Damascus, is that the Turks and the Qataris are aware of the sensitivities of all this. You know, don't want to see a repeat of a situation in which they're seen as Turkey at least certainly was in the early days, in the case of Islamic State, to be supporting movements that then turn out to be, you know, catastrophic and insane enemies of states that Turkey needs to maintain proper relations with. So I think the Turks are trying very hard to make sure that HTS behaves itself. Much will depend, I think, on how this plays out. Sunni jihadis generally don't have a very good track record at sort of maintaining the semblance of sanity for very long in the Arab world. Yahya Sinwar would be a case in point there, and of course ISIS, another one. Jolani's a smart operator, so we'll see how this plays out. But if it turns out that Syria under HTS turns into a Sunni Islamist nightmare, then I think the Turks will have some explaining to do, so to speak. If, on the other hand, they maintain stability, then then it can look different. So it really depends on what happens now. With regard to Israel, by contrast, I think that Turkey's relations with Israel are not good in any case. I mean, the economic relationship has remained, but on a political and strategic level, the relations are at a nadir. And I suspect that the emergence of a Sunni Islamist government, which will with fairly close to certainty, at least on the verbal level, will be deeply hostile to Israel in the months ahead, will just serve, I think, to further poison and cause further deterioration in the relations between Israel and Turkey, which are bad anyway, for not any more complicated a reason than that Turkey is currently led by an ideological Islamist leader who is, by his very nature, attracted to and supportive of forces actively engaged in whether political or sometimes even paramilitary action against Israel. That's not going to change. And I think the emergence of Jolani to power in Damascus is just going to compound that situation.
Thank you. David Fine would like to ask, do we know the status of Syria's chemical weapons, and do U.S. forces need to go in to secure control of these weapons?
We don't know, of course, in precise detail, but we do know, and I mean, we can say with confidence the following. In spite of its commitment, of course, a decade ago to dismantle its chemical weapons program, the Bashar Assad regime did nothing of the kind. There are confirmed instances of subsequent use of chemical weapons, and we're also aware of such facilities as the Masyaf facility in central Syria in Hama province, where research into and production of chemical weapons were continuing after that date. It does appear that some of Israel's actions have been carried out precisely directed against the chemical weapons capacities of Syria. Of course, I'm not able to say, I don't know whether that has led to the 100% destruction of those facilities, but it does appear that action has been taken against those facilities. I would not expect that further ground action by either American or Israeli forces will take place at this stage. I hope very much that what action has taken place, and there has been from the air, perhaps accompanied by small groups of special forces on the ground, who knows, will have proven sufficient to remove that danger for now. Certainly, it would be very worrying indeed if those facilities were to fall into the hands of an organization which is now going to rule Syria, which, you know, without need to reach for metaphors, literally 8 years ago was the official Syrian franchise of the al-Qaeda network. So, yeah, that's the situation.
Thank you. Now, on a similar note, we have a question from Syed Golkar, who asks, how would the fall of the Assad regime impact Iran's nuclear program? And to follow up, we have another question. Will/should Israel use this opportunity to try to take out Iran's nuclear facilities?
Yeah, I think that, thank you for the question, Aside. I think that, questions. I think that with regard to the first one, I do think that the eclipse of Iran's proxy strategy, which I think, you know, we can say with some confidence has now taken place. I mean, the notion that Iran had of surrounding Israel with sort of contiguous with paramilitary forces with a contiguous link back to Iran, and then supplying them, and then subjecting Israel to a kind of death by 1,000 cuts. That whole stuff, which was a very important central part of Iranian national strategy, is now to a great extent being frustrated, being defeated. Now, there is a view taken by some analysts, and I think there's a certain amount of sense to it, which says, well, okay, if the Iranians have had that sort of arm of their national security strategy, so to speak, or ambition frustrated, they must then surely naturally turn back to the other elements, namely ballistic missiles and the nuclear program. And there is some evidence to suggest that the Iranians are now going full speed, or now increasing the speed with regard to production of enrichment of uranium to 60% and so forth. I don't know, and I wouldn't want to state categorically, as some others have, that, okay, now it's inevitable that Iran will seek breakout to a nuclear weapon in the imminent future. Well, they maybe know that. I couldn't be able to say it with that amount of confidence. But yeah, I do think it makes it more likely now that the tool of the proxies is largely gone, that the regime will turn with greater attention back to the nuclear program, which brings me to your second question. Might then this be a good time for Israel to think about further forward action against the Iranian nuclear program, or indeed perhaps against other elements of the Iranian regime and its governance? My answer to that is yes. I think we do have something of a golden opportunity right now. All the proxy forces that we were told existed in order to be activated should Israel take such action are currently bruised and wounded, and in the case of Lebanese Hezbollah, headless, you know, without a leader, effectively. Iran's air defenses, we've learned, at least as a result of Israel's action of the night of October 26th, are currently crippled. the Iranians themselves are reeling and on the back foot as a result of a series of setbacks, yes, I think this would be an opportune time now to go into a mode of offense, having carried out, I think it's fair to say, Israel's stance since October 8th, so to speak, of 2023, having now carried out an effective blocking and defense of Iran's attack. It might well now be an opportune moment to go on the attack at a time when the enemy remains with precisely the same strategic ambitions, not moderated in the slightest, but at the same time is in an extremely vulnerable position. Yes.
All right, well, thank you. We have a question here from Andrew Rosemarine, a international lawyer based in the UK. He asks, Assad continues to have support from Russia and hopes to restore his rule over Syria when circumstances are favorable. What steps, if any, should America and the UK take to make that more difficult for this mass murderer?
That's an interesting way of phrasing the question, Andrew. I mean, Bashar Assad and his family have, of course, received asylum from the Russians, and they now, I guess, are looking forward to living an opulent life in Moscow or wherever, using the stolen billions which the family have amassed since the early 1970s. The notion that either Bashar himself or indeed the Russians hope to restore him as dictator in Damascus, and the notion that they want to sort of bring back that regime and see that as realistic is not one which I'm particularly familiar with. I don't know if Bashar wants to be president again, but even if he does, I'm not at all convinced that the Russians would now see it as a realistic prospect. My own sense, rather, and I found this very interesting in recent days, is that the Russians and indeed former regime officials, up to and including the people of Assad's own hometown in the last couple of hours in Kandahar, in Latakia province, appear to be adapting themselves quite quickly, actually, to a new situation. So I don't doubt that the Iranians and Lebanese Hezbollah and their axis will seek to make all kinds of mischief in the period ahead in Syria, precisely because they represent sectarian interests that might well now be directly targeted by the emergent new regime in Syria, new Sunni Islamist regime that appears to be coming into being in Syria. But I'm not quite convinced that the Russians, who, you know, apart from anything else, tend to be fairly canny operators, at least in the case of Putin and those around him, will see any realistic chance of a restoration of Bashar Assad. If I can put it in sort of old-fashioned European terms, you know, the notion of Bashar being a kind of king over the water who could sort of gather opposition around him in the way that Reza Pahlavi is trying to do now in the case of the Iranian crown prince. I'm not even sure if he's having that much success, but it's hard for me to imagine Bashar Assad forming that kind of a figure. And even if he does want to be, I really don't think the Russians will be getting behind that. So I don't think so. My sense, at least, is that with remarkable speed, the period of Bashar Assad, the period of the Assads, has sort of rapidly, with indecent haste, you might say, departed the stage. And right now we're into a whole new era. That's my sense, at least, unless I've missed something very major, but that's certainly been my reading of it.
Thank you. Now, moving on to a question here from Adam Turner, who asks, what is happening with the Alawite and Druze minorities, and do you think either is capable or likely of creating their own autonomous region?
Yeah, the Alawis do have weaponry. And I was talking to somebody in Syria about this today, and there are Alawi militias, I mean, armed Alawis in the Alawi heartland in the western coastal area of Latakia province of Syria, who are watching the situation very carefully. But as I said, just a couple of hours before us having this meeting, an item of news has come out that the elders of Kandahar town, which is the home village of the Assads, right in the Alawi heartland of Latakia province, have agreed to give up their weapons to the new authority and are willing basically to be, to sign allegiance, so to speak, to the new and emergent government. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, my sense, at least, is that there still will be armed Alawis out there. At least what I was hearing up to today is that their hope was that the Russians, who of course are still hoping to maintain their naval bases on the Mediterranean coast, that they would make some kind of a deal for the Alawis, not necessarily where they would have a sort of de facto independent autonomy, but at least where their security would be guaranteed by the new regime. So I think we are going in that direction, at least as of now. There's still armed Alawis out there. They certainly don't trust the emergent government. They may well be looking to make some kind of a deal to guarantee their security and bide their time. There does not appear to be, at least as of now, a kind of militant effort underway on the western coastal area for an independent autonomy. With regard to the Druze have just done what they're very good at doing, which is they switch sides at exactly the right moment, because of course they were largely associated with a sort of conditional acceptance of the regime for most of the period of the civil war. And exactly at the right moment down there in Sweden, over the last few days, they began to raise the rebel flag, the Syrian Republic flag, just in time to sort of align themselves with the emergent force. I don't think the Druze will try and establish an independent republic or even an autonomy. And the reason I don't think they'll do that is because that doesn't tend to be what the Druze do. What they tend to try to do is to announce to any central government that they, the Druze, are formidable fighters, and if anyone tries to drive them off their lands, they won't have a pleasant time of it. But that short of that, the Druze will give their allegiance to a powerful central government, as long as it doesn't bother their freedom of worship and their ability to stay on their lands. So I think much will depend on what the new government looks like. Again, if it turns out to be a crazy Sunni jihadi operation, then it's going to run into all kinds of trouble with minority communities. If, on the other hand, they manage to kind of pursue a more pragmatic line, then it wouldn't surprise me to see them seeking to co-opt Druze figures in the same way that the previous regime tried to do. I do think that the most worrying prospects now are for the Kurdish minority, simply because the Kurdish minority have an existing autonomy with, of course, a powerful armed forces to defend it. And the state that stands most behind what's just happened in Syria is the Republic of Turkey, i.e. is the Syrian Kurds' greatest enemy. So I think there's a considerable amount to worry about with regard to the future of that entity. The Alawis certainly have what to worry about as well, just because there may well be an outburst of popular fury against them because of some of the atrocities that are now coming to light. And the Alawis, of course, were most associated with the previous regime. So much will depend on how the new government handles that. And with regard to the Druze, I suspect that they will make their peace with the new dispensation in the way that the Druze very often successfully managed to do throughout the region.
Right. Thank you. Now, we've unfortunately reached the end of our podcast for the week, and I apologize that I couldn't get to all of your questions. They're all fantastic questions. I've got about 30 of them here in the queue, but we have reached the end here. So I want to thank you again, Jonathan, for taking the time to share your insights on this topic.
Thank you very much, Arnav.
Of course. Now, for our viewers and listeners, please join us on Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for our Israel Insider podcast this week with Alex Selsky. And if you've not done so already, please subscribe to the Middle East Forum's YouTube channel, where you can watch this series as well as over 400 of our past podcast episodes. And again, I want to thank you all for joining us and for your participation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.